So, we are back to the book of Judges. We saw Samson being announced as, his coming being announced in chapter 13. We see him being born there at the end of chapter 13, last couple verses. The woman bore a son and called his name Samson. And the young man grew, and the Lord blessed him. And the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him and name Dan. He's a Danite. He should be in the land of Dan. That's how God had established this for the Old Covenant, Old Testament people, the Jews, the Israelites, the Hebrews, that they would be within their land and that their land would be passed on. But we have seen over and over and over of Samson that Samson doesn't like to stay home. And Samson not only doesn't like to stay home, he doesn't even like to stay within his own people group. He doesn't like to stay within the people that are supposed to be worshiping God. He likes to find himself over in the Philistines, in the enemy camp. And that so far has not worked out so well for him. It was there in chapter 14 when we see Samson get married. He found a woman that he said, "Get her for me, for she's right in my eyes," he told his parents. And they do so. And of course, the result of that is that her and her father end up being burnt to the ground inside of their house, burnt alive. And that causes Samson to then want to have repercussions. He wants to get vengeance for that. And so it says there at the end of chapter 15 that as he goes and gets his vengeance upon them, the 3,000 men of Judah come and get him. He finds a fresh jawbone of a donkey and he kills 1,000 men with it. And we find the only time that we see Samson kind of talking to God at the end of chapter 15, and not even really a prayer, but more of just hey, you got to help me out here kind of thing. And that is there in verse 17. As soon as he finished speaking, there in chapter 15, as soon as he finished speaking, he threw away the jawbone out of his hand, and that place was called Ramath-Lehi. And he was very thirsty and called upon the Lord and said, "You've granted this great salvation by the hand of your servant, and now shall I die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised." And God split open the hollow place, that is at Lehi, and water came out from it. And when he drank, his spirit returned, and he revived. Therefore the name of it was called in Hakor, as it is at Lehi to this day. And Samson judged Israel in the days of the Philistines 20 years. Which brings us to the last and final chapter, verse 1 of chapter 16. We don't have to stand up and go through. I'm just going to read through the first 3 verses and we'll just start going through this together. So Samson went to Gaza, and there he saw a prostitute, and he went into her. The Gazites were told, "Samson has come here," and they surrounded the place and set an ambush for him all night at the gate of the city. They kept quiet all night, saying, "Let us wait till the light of the morning, then we'll kill him." But Samson lay till midnight, and at midnight he arose and took hold of the doors of the gate of the city and the 2 posts and pulled them up, bar and all, and put them on his shoulders and carried them to the top of the hill that is in front of Hebron. Interesting kind of scenario as we look at how this whole kind of chapter starts here. We see Samson goes to Gaza. That's not Dan. That's not the land that he's supposed to be. He goes to Gaza. And why does he go to Gaza? Because Samson, as we've seen so far, is a man who has a problem with women. Samson will do just about anything for a pretty girl. And when we look at Samson in chapter 16, we see the way that the thing starts. We see what has become of Samson. Now remember, Samson was a Nazirite. That didn't mean just having long hair, not cutting his hair. It meant some other things. He wasn't supposed to touch a dead body. What did he do? Well, for one, he made plenty of dead bodies himself. But on top of that, what did he do? He tore a lion to pieces, and later on he sees a bunch of bees inside of there, and he sees that there's a honeycomb, and he scrapes honey out of the dead carcass of a lion. He's not supposed to touch a dead body, but he does, and he eats it, and he gives it to his mom and dad and doesn't even tell them that it came out of the carcass of a dead lion. We see Samson, the guy that is a Nazirite that's supposed to abstain from anything from the vine. No juice, no wine, no grapes, no raisins, no skins of grapes, no seeds of grapes, none of that stuff. And what do we see? He's constantly walking amongst the vineyards, getting closer and closer and closer to sin. When he goes and he gets married, what does he do? He throws what is literally in the English, he throws a drunk party. So he's hanging around with drunks. He's not supposed to have wine or any strong drink, but we see this pattern with Samson in that he continues to violate what it is that God laid upon his life from before he was even born. And then now what do we see about him? Well, he's just going down that slope of sin. He's just continuing the path. Samson went to Gaza, and there he saw a prostitute, and he went into her. Well, that's just Bible language for they had sexual relations with each other. This is what has become of Samson. This is the kind of guy that he is. And yet, what's really crazy about this is you go back, and when you go back, you see that the angel comes and he speaks to Samson's mom and says, "Behold, you are barren and have not borne a child, but you shall conceive and bear a son. Therefore be careful and drink no wine or strong drink, and eat nothing unclean. For behold, you shall conceive and bear a son, and no razor shall come upon his head. For the child shall be a Nazirite to God from the womb, and he shall begin to save Israel from the hand of the Philistines." This boy who turned into a man was supposed to be a man of God. And it's crazy because you look at Samson and you see a man who has spoiled potential. He had a calling upon his life. The Spirit of God, 4 times in these chapters, we see that the Spirit of the Lord came upon Samson. Do you know what we see even with the best judges? Once you read the Spirit of God came upon him. And 4 times, 4 unique times, we have seen the Spirit of God come upon Samson. And yet all of that Spirit of God coming upon Samson did nothing to change his life and to change his heart. Here he is. We start his last chapter with him laying with a prostitute. What a bummer Samson is. What a bummer he's become. But look at what happens here. So the Gazites were told. Now everybody's looking for vengeance on Samson. You know this. He's a thorn in the side of the Philistines. So the Gazites were told, "Hey, Samson's in town. He came here. He's with the prostitute. He's laying in her house right now in her bed." And so they surrounded the place. They surrounded this woman's house, and they set an ambush for him all night. Where at? Well, at the gate of the city. They're ready. Soon as Samson comes out in the morning, we're going to watch, we're going to whistle. Here he comes, here he comes. And as soon as he goes outside the gate of the city, we've got him. We've got an ambush. We're going to jump him. We're going to take him. We're going to finally get rid of this guy. But notice, they kept quiet all night. They're trying to be sneaky. And they said, "Hey, let's wait until the light of the morning. Then we'll kill him. Let's just take it easy for tonight, fellas. We'll just camp out here. We'll get a good night's sleep so that in the morning we could kill Samson real good." So they wait till the light of the morning, then we will kill him. But Samson lay until midnight. And at midnight he arose, and he took hold of the doors of the gate of the city and the 2 posts, and he pulled them up, bar and all, and put them on his shoulders and carried them to the top of the hill that is in front of Hebron. Now, you know, kids' church stuff. You usually see, this is where you usually see a picture of Samson, like, you know, a big old bodybuilder, and he's carrying the gates of the city, and they look, you know, because they're a cartoon, kind of small, not too big, and he's just kind of carrying it like you would carry the gates of a picket fence or something. But that's not the case. When you look at the way that gates and bars and all of the stuff were built in those days, this means that Samson on his own has now picked up somewhere around 2,000 pounds, making him the strongest man in history. He's picked up about 2,000 pounds and he's carried it to the hill that's in front of Hebron. Now, there are differing opinions among scholars about, just which Hebron this was, but it is possible that Samson carried this 2,000 pound gate and bars and all this stuff some 40 miles away. Would have taken a couple of days, I'm sure, to carry that. So here he is, carrying gates. Now, the gates to the city, at least as wide as the platform, that I'm on here, from this wall to this wall, at least that wide has to be wide enough for many to come in, for horses to come in, for chariots to come in, for carts to come in, bringing and selling their goods, all this stuff. And he picks up some 2,000 pounds and he walks it some 40 miles. And yet, he spoiled his potential. He's doing amazing things, but he spoiled his potential. He's been hanging out at the vineyard. He's been getting drunk with his buddies. He's scooping honey out of dead lions. He's sleeping with prostitutes. Can you imagine what God could have done with a guy like Samson if Samson's heart was for the Lord? Like, we see Samson doing incredible things that only could be done with the strength and the power that God gave him. But can you imagine if he was committed to the Lord and not a guy that was ruled by his flesh? This is the problem here. And I have to tell you that in 20 years of serving Jesus, in 10 years of being a senior pastor, I can't tell you how many men I have seen fall, though God did amazing things in their lives, because they were ruled by the flesh. I can't tell you how many I have seen fallen and be completely destroyed, be cast out of ministry and everything because they're ruled by their flesh. Either they become thieves and they steal the money, or they become sexual predators and they weigh on the women in the church and use their influence as the pastor to get their way with them. And we have just seen horrendous things. And yet just last week, another horrible news story of a pastor falling in the same kind of way. And imagine what God would do with Samson if he wasn't ruled by his flesh and now hanging out with prostitutes. Look at what happens here in verse 4. After this, we presume pretty quickly after this took place, after this, he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. Now that's already, like, when I read that in your head, you probably hear, at least you should hear, dun, dun, dun. Because it's Delilah. It's a name that's synonymous with a wicked woman. It's as synonymous with wicked woman as the name Jezebel. And he loved a woman. This is interesting. When he found his wife, he didn't love her. She was just well-pleasing in his sight. She was just, good looking. But here, he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek. Sorek, it's a place of indulgence. It literally means the place of the good grapes, the good vineyard. I mean, he's hanging out in the amongst the vineyards still. He's not supposed to be there. He's a Nazirite. He's not supposed to even have anything to do with the fruit of the vine. After this, he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek whose name was Delilah. And the lords of the Philistines came up to Delilah and said to her, "Seduce him and see where his great strength lies, and by what means we may overpower him, that we might bind him to humble." Another translation, afflict him. By the way, Delilah, we will each give you 1,100 pieces of silver. That's about 140 pounds of silver, and each of them, it seems, would give her that. So that's 140 pounds times 5 of silver. Now, here's the deal. You know what happens when you're ruled by your flesh? You know what happens when you keep hanging out at the vineyard, but you're not supposed to be at the vineyard because you're a Nazirite? You know what happens when you live your life in such a way that you're spending time with prostitutes and you're scooping things out of dead carcasses and all the like? Satan has your number. This whole thing is not going to end well for Samson. Satan knows that Samson has a problem with women. And he knows that the way to take Samson out is with a woman. Satan knows that Delilah has a problem with wanting money and wealth. And he knows how to take her out. You have the perfect scenario, the perfect storm for Satan to get a victory. Seduce him. He loves women. Seduce him. We don't care if you're into him or not. We know how this guy operates. He'll take the bait. And we know that you'll take our bait, which is 1,100 shekels or pieces of silver. From this point on, we're going to see Samson's downfall until the very end of the chapter when we see him kind of, finish well, though he didn't live well at all. So Delilah said to Samson, "Please tell me where your great strength lies and how you might be bound that one could subdue you." Okay, if you're Samson, right? Like, how many times do you read this? But if you're Samson, you're like, you know what? I left something in the car. I'll be right back. And then you drive away and never come back. And it's interesting because right away they come to Delilah and they go, "Hey, Delilah, could you seduce him? And then find out where his great strength lies so that we could take him out, so we could humble him, so we could afflict him." And it would seem here that, kind of first date material here, Delilah goes, "Hey, Samson, you're pretty cute. You want to go out? Yeah, let's go out together. Hey, Samson, was just always kind of wondering, where does your great strength lie? Like, how could we subdue you? How could we take you out? How could we destroy you?" And notice that Samson is going to play along with the game. He's so far removed from where he should be in his walk with the Lord that now he just loves to flirt with disaster. Now also, here's the other thing. We have no idea. I said this when we started in Samson's life. We have no idea what kind of guy Samson was in appearance. We don't know if he was a big guy or a little guy or what. He must have not been too big because look at her direct question. Tell me where your great strength lies. If he looked like a bodybuilder, she would have been like, "Oh, you're a bodybuilder. That's why you're so strong and you can lift 2,000 pounds and walk at 40 miles away." We have no idea. He may have just looked like everybody else, except for the hair and the beard of a Nazarite. So she says, "Tell me where your great strength lies and how you might be bound that one could subdue you." And Samson says to her, "Well, if they bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings that have not been dried, then I shall become weak and," note, "be like any other man." Okay, we have a problem here. Samson recognizes that he's not like any other man. He knows he's not like any other man. Let me just sort of say this here, and I don't think any of you have any issues here, but just so that it's there and it's on record, and whether it's for you or somebody that'll listen later or whatever, we're Christians. We're not meant to be like every other person. We're meant to be unique and different and special, a chosen people for God. We are meant to be a people filled with the Holy Spirit who are in this world but not of this world. Samson realizes he's not like everybody else, and yet he says, okay, for me to be like everyone else, here's what it's going to take. And then he sort of throws on her this thing that some scholars say was actually a thing for the Hittites. And the Hittites, they would, as they were kind of coming into manhood and becoming, warriors, they would bound them with 7 fresh bowstrings. And if they got out of it, then they were sort of, it was sort of their way of getting into special forces, if you will. And so she says, hey, how do I do this? How do we bind you? How do we subdue you? And so he flirts with disaster. And he says, if they bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings that have not been dried, then I shall become weak and be like any other man. Well, then the lords of the Philistines brought up to her 7 fresh bowstrings that had not been dried. And she bound him with them. Now, can you picture the way that this is working in play this out in your head. What does this look like? Samson, tell me how we could bind you so that we could subdue you and destroy you. Well, honey, if you just get 7 fresh, okay. I got 7 fresh bowstrings. Okay, honey. Samson, put your arms behind your back. I want to try this out. Okay, honey. What in the world is this? What kind of weird relationship is this? But notice how arrogant and cocky that Samson has become. Go right ahead, honey. Go right ahead. He doesn't realize, and we're going to see at the end of this little section here, he doesn't realize that he has been so far from the Lord and toying around with God's grace for so long that God has departed from him already. Now, not yet though, watch. And so she does so. She binds him with them. Now now she had men lying in ambush in an inner chamber. Okay, think about this. She's tied him up with exactly the thing that he said. And she has men lying in an inner chamber. This means like they're right there in the other room. And she said to him, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." But he snapped the bowstrings as a thread of flax snaps when it touches the fire, so the secret of his strength was not known. Can you imagine what's going on with these guys in the other room? Philistines are upon you. Da-da-da. Oh, whoops. Okay, well, stay back in place. You have to realize that when I read this, I have trouble believing that Samson didn't know what Delilah was up to and didn't know that there were men waiting for him in the inner chamber. I don't know how Samson could have not known all of this, except that Samson has been so accustomed to just playing the game. On the outward, he keeps all the outward appearances of his Nazirite vow and of being a man surrendered to God. But inwardly, he's nowhere near God where he should be at all. So that he's toying with the idea, just sort of waiting for the guys to come out from the other room because, then it's open season on Philistines and he gets to kill a few more. He's been accustomed to God's grace being rich upon him, even in his sin. Now look at verse 10. Well, then Delilah said to Samson, "Behold, you have mocked me and told me lies. Please, Samson, honey, tell me how you might be bound." What in the world? Like, what is Samson doing with a chick like Delilah? But this is exactly what sin does. It blinds you. It destroys you. It makes you not think straight. And he said to her, "Okay, honey, okay. If they bind me with new ropes that have not been used, then I shall become weak and be like any other man." Man, he is toying with this. So Delilah took new ropes and bound him with them. And again, Samson had to be playing along. "Okay, honey, you can tie my hands behind my back again." And then she said to him, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you, Samson." And the men lying in ambush were in an inner chamber, but he snapped the ropes off his arms like a thread. That's twice. Then Delilah said to Samson, "Until now you have mocked me and told me lies. Tell me how you might be bound, Samson." And he said to her, "If you weave the 7 locks of my head with the web and fasten it tight with the pin, then I shall become weak and be like any other man." Do you realize how close Samson is to absolute, utter ruin? We know the story. It's when his hair gets cut off. He's a Nazirite. Now, the power isn't in his hair, obviously, but he knows that this outward appearance is the only thing that he's got going for him in his relationship with the Lord, because inwardly he is just wicked and sick and gross. He's spiritually sick. He's spiritually gross. And now what does he say? He gets a little closer to it. The fire's right there, and Samson just can't help but get closer and closer and closer. Well, if you take my hair and weave it, Samson, what are you doing? But can I just say that for any of us who have ever sinned against the Lord, you know full well that your sin wasn't immediate, that was a building up before your fall. It was a building up. Here's Samson, building up, building up, building up before we're about to see that the Lord had left him altogether. And so, here she is, whining, crying, seducing, figuring out the riddle here. So he says, well, just weave the 7 locks of my head, which, by the way, side note, it is believed that most Nazarites had dreadlocks, much like you think of like dreadlocks, like Rastafarian or whatever. But the idea with the Nazarites was there was in history set a very strict rule that if you were a Nazarite, that they wouldn't even let you comb your hair, even though it was to be long, lest you accidentally break off hair in the combing of it and then be guilty of cutting your hair and violating your Nazarite vow. So when he says my 7 locks, like he probably just had 7 big old dreadlocks. And by now, Samson is no doubt somewhere in his 30s, so he's got a nice big long head of dreadlocks. And he says, put them together, weave them in the weaver's loom, and then put the pin in there, and then I'll be subdued. That's all it takes. And so, while he slept, and it's so weird to me that all this stuff, we see this while he sleeps here, and then while he's going to sleep when she cuts it off. Isn't it a weird thing that, like, he doesn't notice her weaving his hair in the loom while he sleeps? Okay, either he's completely oblivious, a hard sleeper, or he's come to that place that sometimes people come, where he is so sick in sin that he's ready to give up and to fall headlong into sin. And he's perfectly content for her to weave his hair because he knows that before long, he'll get the desire of his heart, which is to not walk with the Lord at all. So while he slept, Delilah took the 7 locks of his head and wove them into the web, and she made them tight with the pin. And somehow he didn't wake up with all the pulling. Made him tight with the pin and said to him, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." But he awoke from his sleep and pulled away the pin in the loom and the web. And she said to him, "How can you say I love you when your heart is not with me? You have mocked me these 3 times, and you have not told me where your great strength lies." Maybe if you're Samson, you're sort of going like, how can you say you love me when you keep trying to kill me? But that's not his heart. He's a man ruled by the flesh, a man ready to please his woman at any cost, spiritually, physically, or otherwise. He's ruled by his flesh. And so she says, she pulls out the whole, "You don't love me, you won't tell me." Look at verse 16. And when she pressed him hard, meaning she just kept after him and nagging him and whining. When she had pressed him hard with her words day after day and urged him, his soul was vexed to death. She just kept on and on and on and on and on, and finally goes, "Fine, I'll tell you already." And he told her all his heart. And he said to her, "Razor has never come upon my head, for I have been a Nazarite to God from my mother's womb." Isn't it interesting as he says this? No doubt Samson must be thinking about his mom and his dad, who raised him the way that the angel of God said to raise him, raised him the right way, gave him all the advantages of a godly son. God's Spirit had been upon him multiple times. He had seen God do amazing things, and he was willing to throw it all away for Delilah. "Razor has never come upon my head, for I have been a Nazarite to God from my mother's womb. If my head is shaved, then my strength will leave me, and I shall become weak and be like any other man. When Delilah saw that he had told her all his heart, she sent and she called the lords of the Philistines and said, hey, I know that there's that 1,100 shekels from each one of the 5 lords. I'm ready to collect. She said, come up again, for this time he has told me all his heart. Then the lords of the Philistines came up to her and brought the money in their hands. And she made him sleep on her knees. I don't know if he's sleeping out of sheer exhaustion. I don't know if he's sleeping out of that, that whole like, man, I finally just said everything that was ever to say, and now I'm just going to sleep like a baby. I don't know what. But she made him sleep on her knees. And she called a man and had him shave off the 7 locks of his head. This is tremendously sad before we even read the rest of it. Tremendously sad. He's a Nazirite. His appearance should reflect that he is one separated to God. Those 7 locks should be there as a badge of honor and a badge that says that I am separate from the rest of the world. I am not like every other man. I am separated to my God, for my God to do great things with. And he's so wiped out. And who knows, a guy like Samson, maybe he just got real drunk that night and passed out. And she shaved off the 7 locks of his head. And notice this. Then she, Delilah, not the Philistines, not the ones in the inner chamber, then she began to torment him. And his strength left him. So she said, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. And he awoke from his sleep and said, I will go out as at other times and shake myself free. But he did not know that the Lord had left him. This is what happens with the person that has a life of sin. They continue in it and continue in it and get worse in it and get worse in it and get worse in it until they don't realize that the Lord has given them what they wanted all along. Their freedom from him. He's ready to, all right. But he can't do anything. He has no strength from God. He didn't know that the Lord had left him. Samson had lived a compromised life for so long that he failed to realize the lack of God's presence. It happened without him noticing. The Philistines seized him, verse 21, and they gouged out his eyes. And they brought him down to Gaza and bound him with bronze shackles, and he ground at the mill in the prison. But the hair of his head began to grow. But before we get to verse 22, the Philistines seized him and gouged out his eyes. Can you imagine the last thing that he sees is Delilah laughing at him and the Philistines going, man, we win. Dagon, our God, wins. Little side note here. It would seem that the events of 1 Samuel chapters 1 through 6 have already taken place in history. So you can go and read those things for yourself. That Samuel's already judging, that the ark has already been taken once by the Philistines, and that when it sat in the house of Dagon, the god of the Philistines, that Dagon fell over. One day his hands was gone. The next day it fell over. His head had rolled off. All the people there that worshiped Dagon, they started getting tumors and boils and all this stuff. There were mice coming and all kinds of, plagues upon them. And they fill up the Ark of the Covenant with golden mice and tumors and all this stuff and send it back, realizing that God is bigger than their Dagon, little g God. And all of a sudden, here they are, and they go, but we got God's man. We may not have the ark of God. We may not have the place where the God of Israel dwells, but we have God's man that God chose, and we're going to take care of this guy by gouging out his eyeballs. But you know what the problem is? Samson was already spiritually blind before they ever took his eyes out, because he did not know that the Spirit of God had already left him. He was blinded by his party life, by hanging out in the vineyard, by eating honey from the dead animal carcasses, by desiring ungodly women, and every other thing that God was gracious enough to not include in the story of Samson. And so, he's been seized. His eyes have been gouged out. They brought him back down to Gaza, where he was laying with the prostitute at the beginning of the chapter. They bound him with bronze shackles that he can't break. And they had him grinding at the mill in the prison, being a prison slave. You know, it's been said, I'm sure, by a number of better pastors or preachers or Bible teachers than me, but sin will grind on you until you have spent your time grinding out the repercussions of your sin. And he's grinding at the mill in the prison. But take note of verse 22. But. If you have a King James or something else, it probably says, however. In my Bible, I underlined a bunch of things in this chapter, but I underlined that word but. If you have a King James or New King James or CSB, it probably says, however, I'd underline that. And next to that, I would write the word grace. But the hair of his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. Even though Samson was such a disobedient man, God's grace was still real and effective towards Samson. Now, this is an interesting thing, because this same sin that Samson was participating in was even the sin of the people of the Philistines, and sin makes you dumb. So dumb that the Philistines didn't think to send a barber in every morning and reshave Samson's head and his face. Because if this guy that caused all this trouble to your people said, the only way for me to be subdued and to be like every other man is if you shave my head, I'd be thinking there'd be a barber in every morning, bick balding Samson's head, keeping it nice and shiny, fresh. But they didn't do that. They didn't do that because they thought, we've got him. We've poked his eyes out. What's he going to do? The hair of his head began to grow again after he had been shaved. Now listen, the hair had no power. The hair was a physical attribute of the relationship that Samson was to have with God as a Nazirite. When you see his hair, when you see it mentioned in the text that the hair of his head began to grow again, this is God's grace on display. Watch this. Now the lords of the Philistines gathered to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon, their god, and to rejoice. And they said, our God's better than your God. They said, our God has given Samson, our enemy, into our hand. No, Samson's God gave Samson into your hands. Dagon had nothing to do with this. And when the people saw him, they mocked, they ridiculed, they praised their God. For they said, our God has given our enemy into our hand, the ravager of our country, who has killed many of us. And when their hearts were merry, translation, when they got good and drunk, they said, Got a good idea? Call Samson that he may entertain us. Let's turn the man that once killed many and moved our gates and all the stuff, burned our fields, turning foxes' tails, tail to tail. Let's bring him out here and make him a circus clown. Call Samson that he may entertain us. So they called Samson out of the prison, and he entertained them. Imagine, all dignity gone. And they made him stand between the pillars. Now, by the way, they have been able to excavate this section, this place here, and they found that the pillars were very tall and very narrow. In fact, we're going to read that there were 3,000 people up on the next level up. This was a very large place where they're gathered here. And so when their hearts were merry, they called Samson and said for him to come and entertain him. And they did, and they made him stand between the pillars. So Samson said to the young man, other translation, Samson said to the lad who was holding his hand. I want you to consider this for just a moment. The scene is that Samson, the strongest man who ever lived, who had only had one weakness, which happened to be his flesh, and most specifically women who are ungodly, is now there with his eyes gouged out. No eyeballs left in his head. They've pulled them out. He's there, a weak man, because all of his strength has been gone, because his strength came from the Lord. The people are ridiculing him, but more than that, the people are mocking God and paying homage and worship and praise to their God, little g God, Dagon. And so helpless and harmless in the eyes of the Philistines is Samson that they have a little boy walking him around by the hand. Come on, Samson. Come on. This shows that they have completely humiliated Samson, totally humiliated him, that a little boy is walking him around. But watch. Samson said to the young man who held him by the hand, "Let me feel the pillars on which the house rests, that I may lean against them." It's interesting that he does this. He's playing right into what's going on here. He goes, I'm so weak, I just need to lean against the pillar, especially after I just got done entertaining everybody. Young man, could you just take me to where the pillar is so I could lean against it? Now, it's really interesting, right? Because he says, let me feel the pillar on which the house rests. But this little boy, he doesn't know what's going on. But Samson gives a little indication of what he's about to ask God to do. Now, the house was full of men and women. All the lords of the Philistine were there. And on the roof, there were around 3,000 men and women who looked on while Samson entertained. Notice verse 28. Then Samson called to the Lord. Not like before where Samson goes like, hey, I'm thirsty. I'm going to die of thirst over here after this great victory I brought. No. Now we see Samson really humble himself and pray. Then Samson called to the Lord and he said, "Oh Lord God, please remember me." Do you know that this is what the prayer of the repentance should always be? Remember me, Lord. I blew it. I messed up. It's time for me to come back. The prodigal wants to come home. Samson called to the Lord and he said, "Oh Lord God, please remember me and please strengthen me only this once, oh God." Notice the heart of Samson right now is like, I know I have wrecked my life. I have blown my life. I just want to do one last good thing, and it requires your strength. Samson realizes, I don't have this on my own. This requires you, God, to do something. So please remember me. Please strengthen me just one more time, God, that I may be avenged on the Philistines for my two eyes. Now, he kind of asked for the wrong thing. What he should be saying is that you, God, might be avenged for the Philistines mocking you. but that I may be avenged on the Philistines for my 2 eyes. And Samson grasped the 2 middle pillars on which the house rested, and he leaned his weight against them, his right hand on the one, his left hand on the other. And Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." Then he bowed with all his strength, and the house fell upon the lords and upon all the people who were in it. So the dead whom he killed at his death were more than those whom he had killed during his life. Now, here's the deal. This is one of those passages, verse 30, where you get scholars come together and going like, well, I don't know. Samson, that sounds like suicide to me. So, I'm pretty sure God doesn't approve of what Samson did. So, Samson probably went to hell for sure. Well, the problem is that he's listed as an example in the Hall of Faith. Hebrews 11:32 through 34. What more shall I say? For time will fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David, of Samuel, and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouth of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. So this isn't one of those I think we read this and think in our head of something like a suicide bomber, kind of martyrish kind of thing. And in a way, Samson's being a martyr here. But what Samson is doing is saying Lord, now's your chance to use me one last time. My life is done. I am a waste. I've realized your grace. I feel it on the top of my head. I feel it on my face. I receive your grace, Lord. I just want to finish well. So, Lord, take out your enemies. And the Lord gave him strength. You have to realize that. God gave him strength in this moment. Samson didn't have strength in himself to push the pillars over. The Lord gave him strength. And he killed more in his death than he did in his life. And verse 31 is always kind of a funny ending to me. Then his brothers and all his family came down and took him and brought him up and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of Manoah his father. Samson judged Israel 20 years. Isn't that kind of a funny ending? Nobody objected to his dad and his brother showing up. Oh, hey, yeah, I know there's thousands of dead Philistines. We're just here for our brother. It's kind of a funny ending in the sense that, even the Philistines had to recognize in that moment, oh, yeah, that same God that we tried to toy with by putting his ark within the temple of Dagon, our God, he is still God, and what we follow is not. And so his brothers, his dad come, they get his body, he gets buried. Or not his dad, but he gets buried in his dad's tomb. So his brothers, his family come, and they get his body, and they buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of Manoah his father, and he had judged Israel for 20 years. All right, well, that was fun. Glad that we're done with Samson now. Read ahead as we get into chapters 17, 18. We get to see a really interesting thing with Micah, a Levite, and then we'll see some pretty weird stuff in chapter 19 and 20. That gets kind of weird. But anyway, read ahead. There's a lot of fun stuff ahead. So, Father, we thank you. We love you. God, would you please speak to our hearts that we would not be like Samson, those that have potential like crazy, those that have your spirit within us and yet are ruled by our flesh. God, would you deliver us from such things? Would you strengthen us in yourself and with your spirit? And God, would you, Lord, make us people of the spirit and not people of the flesh? Would you remove from us, God, the desires that our flesh has at times, which are contrary to your spirit? Would you heal us of those things and free us from those things, Lord, that we might walk according to your will, according to your way. God, would you give us hearts that desire you and to be used by you? Would you do amazing things with our lives that can only come as a result of your Holy Spirit doing a work within us and us being yielded to him, to you. Have your hand upon us as we leave this place. Give us sweet rest. Lord, help us to wake up in the morning eager to seek after you and to serve you. We love you and we thank you and we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. All right, that's it. Time is over. We are dismissed. The Lord bless you guys and keep you.